Well, good morning, everyone. I want to thank you all for being here this morning. We're very happy to have a presentation on PBIS during distance learning. And I know I heard some people, over the last week or so going, what is PBIS? What is that about? And that really is positive behavior interventions and supports. And we're very fortunate to have with us today one of our colleagues. We kind of think of him as part of the Wainimi family. We love working with him. And I'm sure many of you have seen him at our staff development days, but Jeremy Resnick is here with us, and he's going to talk about classroom management during distance learning, what that looks like, and kind of think about kind of currently what you're doing, as well as in the fall, not knowing where we might be, how do we do and implement effective classroom management skills virtually during distance learning. So with no further ado, I'll go ahead and turn it over to Jeremy.
All right, thank you. Good morning, everyone. Nice to see many of you, such as it is. Lots of faces and names I recognize, some I don't, but thank you, Dave, for that introduction. Yeah, Jane Wagmeister and myself, we definitely feel like part of the Wainimi family, as does most of our department. So we appreciate any time we can work with you all. And so I'm excited just to share some kind of tips and tricks and some thoughts today about what classroom management means during this. And Dave set it up perfectly. Some of this stuff might be immediately relevant. You can start doing with your classrooms tomorrow. And some of it might just be planting seeds so that in the fall, again, with all the variables that we have up in the air, some of these things might be helpful for you. So what you see on the screen is a URL that if you want to write down, or if somebody wants to put it into the chat for safekeeping as well, this is going to take you to a Google Doc. It's going to prompt you to make a copy. And so I'm going to give folks just a moment to jot that down or go to it on their browser, and I'll show you what it looks like. So I'm going to go off this screen, but I'll come back to it if you haven't had a chance to copy it down. Try to keep it simple. HSD May 21. Awkwardly, HESD May 21 was already taken, so that's why that's there. So what it'll take you to is a document like this. Again, it's going to prompt you to make a copy, but this has all the resources that I'll be talking about. Some I'll get into some detail, some I'm just going to mention, but they're all here for you, including today's presentation. A PDF version of it is there for you, so don't worry about frantically taking notes. There's an article I'm going to mention, and again, some of the resources that we have available. The Ventura County Office of Education has a whole page with all sorts of resources available to you that's linked at the bottom as well. So that's for you as a resource. Let me go back here so you can, great. And so the URL is in the chat as well. I'm going to go forward. So if throughout people have questions about where to find these resources, put it in the chat and someone can copy and paste it in again. So like I said, many of you know me. You've seen me at all sorts of trainings and around your district. But in case you're unaware, my name is Jeremy Resnick. I'm one of our directors with Curriculum and Instruction. Been at the county office going on 4 years now, and have had the privilege of working with you all on a variety of things, multi-tiered system of supports, CHAMP specifically. And so again, happy to be here again with you all. So our guiding question for our time together is this, is I think been the struggle and the tension for many of us. I know that social emotional learning has been the focus of many of these sessions that you've been doing. And I think this is kind of the problem we're running into is how do we set these high expectations that we want to have for our students while also being very compassionate and empathetic of their situations. We know that there are some students who are fortunate enough to be in single family homes and have stable Wi-Fi and have devices that those are the lucky few. We know the reality is we also have many students living in cars. We have students that are in multifamily homes. We have students where Wi-Fi is not a reality, where many siblings all need to use the same device. So not everything is the perfect sort of environment, and we don't have the control that we had when kids are in our classrooms. If a kid came without a pencil, we'd give them a pencil. And so I know that your district's working really hard to get kids the resources they need, but that's the reality we're living in. And so how do we understand that and be compassionate towards that, while still also maintaining some expectations? The last thing we want to do is lower the bar for students, certainly academically. And so how do we, what's that balance? How can we sort of navigate those two things? So I don't know that I'm fully going to answer this question today. You'll probably have better answers than I do, certainly. But that's just kind of the guiding thought that I wanted to get us thinking about first thing this morning. So the way I've structured this session is kind of a series of 5 general tips that I want you to just kind of keep in mind that I think will be helpful for us moving along and kind of structure my thoughts that I wanted to share with you. So the first one is being forgiving of ourselves and others. And I think that has probably been something we've had in the back of our mind, but it's been shoved to the forefront through all of this. Every teacher that I know, every educator I've encountered over the past 2 months is doing everything they can for their kids. Hearts are breaking that we can't be with our students during this time, that we can't, be with them to sort of wrap things up and get them ready for the school year. So, just making sure that we are understanding that we're only human, right? You can only do so much. You have to take care of yourself. Otherwise, you will be in no position to take care of kiddos. So that's just kind of from a social emotional perspective, but also technology wise. The reason I'm starting out with this one is something's going to go wrong today. I guarantee you. My Wi-Fi is going to drop out. I'm going to exit out of the slides when I didn't mean to. My dog's going to bark in the background. Whatever. Your kids are going to bust into the room. You're going to want to eat your breakfast. And that's fine, right? We're totally okay. So I'm setting myself up that something technologically is going to happen. Hopefully it doesn't. But if it does, we're going to be understanding of me, hopefully, and yourselves as well, should you have those same little goofs. So what I wanted to sort of ground us in, and what I hope to do through the next 45-ish minutes together, is model many of the things that I'm going to be sharing with you, not just talking at you. And so one of them is CHAMPS. And so we know that, Wainimi is a CHAMPS district. And so if you need a quick little refresher, this is what CHAMPS stands for. It is simply a nice, explicit way of making our expectations very clear to students, which is always important. And when you're not in the room to help clarify those questions that kids have in the moment, it's even more important. So CHAMPS is, again, just a nice structured way of getting our expectations across. There's nothing magical about this acronym, but it just makes it so that there's this consistent language across your district, so that whether kids are in elementary school, moving into middle school, they become used to this structure. And so it's something that I just encourage you to use. So for our time together, again, I want to model this for you all. And so for conversation, just ask that you stay muted. Use that chat box for Q&A, and Helen or Dave will jump in if need be. If you need help, have a question, again, use the chat, or you can virtually raise your hand through Zoom if you're not sure how to do that. I'll show you in a moment. Our activity is Zoom. I am not modeling good pedagogy at all. I would never recommend that you spend 40 to 45 minutes talking at somebody through Zoom, particularly. So I am well aware of that. But you're adults, it's the morning, you've hopefully on your second or third cup of coffee, and you'll forgive me for that. Movement, do what you need to do. I'm fully aware and in the same boat as you. I've got kids. I've mentioned my dog. We actually have workers here. Our entire air conditioning system went out last week, so they're replacing our entire system, which is just great timing. So if you hear banging going on, then that's what's happening here at my home. So you've got families to take care of. You've got parents, kids, all sorts of things. So do what you need to do. Get that coffee, eat your breakfast. It's all good. Participation, just stay engaged as much as you can via the chat. Again, there's a lot of just kind of me talking, which again is not the best modeling, but stay engaged with each other through the chat. The other tools, there's the private chat feature. If you have things that come up that are interesting to you that you want to have conversations about, put that in the chat, and we can pause and have those conversations. And lastly, we'll know we'll have success when you're able to kind of structure and teach this distance learning while creating some opportunities to connect with your students. And really, I think many of the things that I'm sharing with you translate into a real world environment. So should we be fortunate enough to be in classrooms with kiddos next year, whatever that might be, a lot of this is going to carry over. It's not just distance learning specific, I think. So that leads me to tip number 2. This is true, I think, in a classroom, even more so in a virtual setting. And some of you are probably already doing this or have done it. But the recommendation is whatever amount of time you're setting up to be kind of face-to-face with students, about 5 to 10% of that time should be spent setting up expectations and explaining the logistics, even if they've heard it before. Even if you teach 8th grade and you feel your students are really on it, this is the type of thing that's going to need a lot of repetition. I mean, imagine all the things that you had to repeat to kids in the classroom in the best of circumstances. And so now we have all the distractions that exist in distance learning. They're going to need to hear it over and over and over. One of the things that you'll notice on this screen is in the lower right-hand corner, I have placed the CHAMPS expectations. That's again just me kind of modeling a practice that you might want to consider if you are using slide decks or things like that with kiddos. You can even do it live with Zoom or some other features. It's a nice reminder, a good visual for students to have in as you're going through whatever content you're going through. So to that end, again, you are all probably Zoom experts at this point, so I'm not going to belabor this point. This is mostly for modeling to show visually how we want to go through these things with students and be really explicit on the things we would and would not want them to use. And so you probably recognize some of these faces. You have Nathan and Judy Bowers up there. But just to show, right, if you need to unmute yourself or need to remute yourself for whatever reason, we've got the little mute button. You need to turn your video on and off. You've got that lovely button. Obviously, you have the chat feature, which I think many of you are aware of. Just be conscious of making sure that if you want to chat privately, that's the option you have chosen. Nothing more embarrassing than sending out what you think is a private chat, and it goes to everybody, so just be mindful of that. There's just a few other tools within Google that I'm sure you're aware of, but just as a reminder, if you click participants, you've got a variety of other ways of kind of interacting with people. So when I said virtually raise your hand, that's kind of what I was referring to here. You click that little button, I get a little notification that someone's raised their hand, and there's other little icons there that you can use to also good formative assessments, ask kids to do a thumbs up, thumbs down, yes, no types of responses. So that's kind of what I mean when I said that we really need to explicitly go through the logistics and the explanation that we would want students to use. I've done it very briefly because I'm sure you've heard these sorts of things ad nauseum and you've got a lot of explicit use with Zoom. But kids are going to need to hear it over and over. They're going to need that real sort of minutia and detail level instruction when it comes to just simply how to use the tools that we're using, whatever they are, Zoom or otherwise. So Dave mentioned that kind of focus is PBIS, and so that stands for, as you see on the screen, a positive behavior intervention and supports. It's a very broad, generic term. Loosely, what it means is that we are going to be proactive rather than reactive when it comes to behavioral expectations, and that we're going to have this structure where there's some things we're going to provide for all of our students, and then based on how they react to that, we might need to do something additional for some students, and about 5 to 10% of our students are probably going to need something a little individualized. So again, that's in a classroom environment, that makes sense, and we don't want to throw that out the window during distance learning. Most of the things that I'm going to suggest to you are going to be in that kind of all category, but we need to be aware that just based on their situation and their circumstances, some students are going to need something a little bit more, right? Some students might need a personalized email rather than just an email blast. A few students might need phone calls and house visits, which I know many of you are doing. And so just being aware that the things that I'm sharing are kind of in that all column, but you're going to need to specify for students as needed. So again, PBIS is this generic term, a generic approach. What WINEMI has adopted is the Safe and Civil Schools CHAMPS approach to PBIS. So if PBIS is a generic term, CHAMPS is kind of a brand name, right? So if sneakers is a generic term, Adidas is a brand name. Same thing here. CHAMPS, Safe and Civil Schools, and everything that comes with it is PBIS. And the way that CHAMPS specifically organizes positive behavior interventions and supports is through the acronym that you see on the screen here. If you've been in the CHAMPS trainings that I have done, we've done some refreshers over the past couple of years, you should be familiar with STOIC. That's really this acronym that we want you to use to keep in mind anytime that you are planning for or struggling with some sort of behavior, whatever that might be. So for our time together, I'm really going to focus on these three, kind of how we structure these sorts of experiences for students, how we teach those expectations. I'm not really going to get into observe so much, mostly because of time, but sort of data collection. I want to talk about how we interact with students. I'm not going to touch on correct so much. You can certainly come back at some point and touch on those other two if you want me to. But because our focus is on prevention and creating environments that's going to limit the potential for misbehavior happening in the first place, I wanted to focus on these three. Because if we focus on these three, you should spend a lot less time certainly on that last one. And I'm sure you're seeing types of behaviors that, right, we never really would have expected in a real world environment, simply because of where kiddos are. And I'm guessing the number one thing that you might be struggling with is the engagement, right? How do I get kids simply logged on doing work to begin with? And so some of this might address that. It's where hopefully you're not seeing, physical fights. Hopefully you're not seeing the kinds of things that are a little bit more severe on a school campus, just because of those have been eliminated based on social distancing. So let's talk about structure for a moment. So this is Dr. Randy Sprick, and he introduces this acronym of STOIC. And when it comes to structure, what he says is that structure is organized care. Again, I know you love your students deeply. You are brokenhearted that you can't be there with them, and you've done some amazing things that I've seen just through Twitter to sort of connect with your students, both academically and not. And so when we think about structure, that is one way of demonstrating care. And I know it seems kind of weird, but kids want limits. They want to know what their parameters are. And so when we structure things in a very organized way, sometimes our instinct is to maybe not do that because, well, maybe I'm giving them too much, or maybe it's too much structure and they can't do it. But we want to default to giving them a lot of structure, and then if we need to back off, we can. But there's nothing harder than not having structure and then trying to enforce it. That's really rough. So one of the ways that we communicate our care for students is through that structure. And so when we think about our expectations, sometimes we think we've made things really clear for students. And you need to put yourself in the mind of a student to realize that maybe not so much. So here's an adorable example from this lovely girl named Hope. She read the directions that said, name the quadrilateral. And she said, all right, I'm going to name this one Bobbin, this one Salmon, this one Kate, which is, right, technically wrong. But if you read those directions, Hope did exactly what was asked of her. Now, the teacher, of course, is pulling their hair out, being like, Hope, that's not what I meant. But we can't really blame Hope at this point because those directions were not very explicit and not very clear. What they should have said is, right, using the word bank to the right, label each quadrilateral based on its properties or whatever, something a little more closed. So when we think about how we're going to make expectations clear to students, you're going to need to really overthink it. And you're going to get to a point where you're thinking, well, this is silly. Do I really need to explain this? The answer is yes. You really need to explain it, because if you don't, you're going to get things like what Hope has given here, and we can't blame them, right? They're doing the best they can with the information they have. And so one of the things that a lot of folks are doing to provide some structure is providing schedules for students. And again, I know that can be a little bit varied based on situations and circumstances that our students find themselves in. But I think the key in any sort of schedule is what we see up on the screen here, is that we put into our schedule the things that are important, rather than simply having a schedule to drive our priorities. And so I'm just going to share a couple with you to get a sense of what I'm talking about. I'm not putting these up as examples because I think they're the best. I'm putting them up as examples because they simply have some key features that you might want to keep in mind if you haven't already. And I would also say it's not too late, right? I know we've got just a few weeks to a month left of school. There's no reason you can't start implementing some of these things now, if for no other reason to kind of try them out and kind of work out the kinks so that come fall, you've got a better plan to move forward with. So again, I put this out here not because I think it's great, but it just has a couple features I want to call your attention to. The first one is this idea of sort of small group, and I'm sure many of you are doing that already. Some of you are doing it out of necessity, right? We've got a pretty large group here right now, right? 66 folks. But if you have a classroom of 25, 30, 35 some odd kiddos, it's really hard to give them that individualized attention that they might need. So a lot of teachers are experimenting with small groups. When we say small groups in a traditional classroom setting, usually we're thinking about grouping kids by skill level. That's not really what I'm talking about here, although you could certainly do that. It might be a small group just because I need 5 or 6 kids instead of 25 or 30 to make sure that we kind of get that interaction and kids get a little more attention from you than they might. Some schools are also experimenting with cross-classroom small groups where, right, we're grouping kids across teachers' classrooms for whatever reason. Sometimes it's skill-based, sometimes a specific lesson, and I want to encourage you to experiment with those things as well. Another thing that many teachers are doing, and I'm sure some of you in the room are doing it already, and maybe you can give us some tips on this, but they're offering office hours for students. If they have questions, if directions aren't clear, they just need a little extra help. But what we're also seeing across the county is teachers offering office hours for parents, because parents um, didn't get into this to be teachers, right? They are all of a sudden thrust into this role that, and teacher isn't even the right word because that's not really what they're doing. They're kind of facilitating some learning. And so that's an awkward place for even the best of parents to be in. And so giving them some space and some time to kind of meet with a teacher, ask their own questions. The time that we see here is probably a horrible time to have for parents. So many teachers are being very generous and offering those things, maybe later in the evening because parents are working. They are essential workers. They're working multiple jobs just to put food on the table. So being cognizant of that, but putting yourself out there as kind of a help and a resource to parents as well might be something helpful. And I certainly wouldn't recommend it every day, right? Maybe once a week. I think it's also the kind of thing that, at the school level, if a handful of teachers offer to do it once a week, then not the same person has to do it every single week. You can kind of spread it out because you don't necessarily need to be the teacher in that classroom to assist parents with some of the technical things they might be wanting some help with, or they just might need to cry, right? They just might need to talk to somebody and express the kinds of things, frustrations they're having, and there's a place for that as well. I'll show you another example of a schedule. Again, not because I think it's great, but it just has a couple features that I want to highlight. The first thing about this, and we're hearing a lot of parents asking for this, is kind of a weekly schedule, a week at a glance. It just helps them structure their time and helps them structure their students' time or their children's time. Again, we're talking about multi-family households or in the very least multi-sibling households. And so even in my home, we're fortunate. We have, again, that constant Wi-Fi, but I have 2 daughters. And if they both need to be online at the same time, then we've got some device issues and even just the noise level. So helps people kind of plan what's going on in their homes. But the thing that I really want you to pay attention to on this screen is the colors. So this person has organized their schedule. The green are things that are meant to be live, kind of in person. And again, based on your students' circumstances, there's pluses and minuses for that. And the blue is stuff that's kind of independent work. And the gray is kind of free time or you sort of taking care of yourself time. And so if you look at this at a glance, don't even look at the words, just look at the colors, you'll see that a good 50% of the time is me time, is free time. And I think that's a really important thing. And this is the kind of thing that you could lose sense of if you only look at your schedule at a day at a time. When you see it a week at a glance and kind of color code it like this, it's really important that I would say 50% at least for our students needs to be that brain break time, that free time, that moving around time, and giving them suggestions and thoughts on what they could do during that time, but that kind of mental release. And I think we're all experiencing that when you're in these back-to-back Zooms all day. It's a lot more cognitively challenging than when we're in the classroom. Because in the classroom, if I'm a kiddo, right, and I need a little brain break, I can ask for a glass of water, I can go mess around, I can get in trouble, get sent to the principal's office, all those things that kids do to give themselves those breaks. If we don't provide them, we want to make sure that we're really telegraphing to them that this is something we think is important. And just as it's important for them, let me go back, it's important for teachers as well. This is a teacher's personal schedule, so not for their students, but for themselves. And so many of you are doing this just kind of instinctively and you haven't written it down, and that's fine. But the point is here again, not that I think this is perfect, but it has some things to keep in mind, that you're giving yourself time to get ready for the day, getting your cup of coffee, doing your 10 minutes of yoga, whatever it is you need to do to get yourself mentally prepared for the day. You've kind of scheduled whether you're going to be in some small group time, working with kids as a whole. But let me call your attention to lunch. I sincerely hope that you are not forgetting to stop and eat and give yourself that chunk of time and the luxury of eating. And the thing that you are missing, and some of you are aware of this already, but you might not be aware, is what you're missing is the time in the lunchroom when you get to kind of commiserate and chat with your colleagues. that serves a really important function on a school, that we get together, we get to laugh, we get to cry, we get to talk about, the frustration that we just had in our classroom or things that happened over the weekend, and just kind of, bond. And so you don't have that anymore. So things like what your district is doing right now with these kind of regular meetings once a week to just talk about these things, I think is really important. But I'm hoping also that you're able to find time to just connect with one another on purely a social level. We know some folks are doing like virtual happy hours. Maybe you do want to get together at 11:30 once or twice a week and just kind of eat your lunch with each other. But make sure you're finding time to connect with one another, so that you are not mentally exhausted yourself. Because as we've said before, and you're going to hear it time and time again, if you do not take care of yourself, you are in no position to take care of kids. So that's a little bit about structures, just kind of the idea of having a schedule, giving some parameters for students, and recognizing that that schedule might be unrealistic for some students, and that's okay, right? Let them communicate that, or you communicate it to them, but that's going to be your baseline, right? That this is at least our baseline, and then we're gonna adjust it as needed. But some students do not think to have a schedule themselves, right? Some more organized students might, but unless we really spell it out for kids, this is the time for you to get your work done, they're just not going to get it done. The other thing that I would encourage you to think about, and I've used that term myself a couple times now, is get your work done. I really think it's important that we start differentiating between work and learning. This is not about work completion. It's about mastering standards. That's what we do. We are standards-based educators. And so making sure that we're focusing on the learning and not necessarily the worksheet getting completed. Now, those two could certainly be the same in lots of circumstances, but really focusing on, are we creating experiences that create those learning times? So once you kind of created that structure, we need to be able to teach students what our expectations are. Again, really explicitly. So explicitly that it seems silly to you as an adult, but it won't be for students, I promise you. So what I really want to encourage you to do, and I'm sure you've done this instinctually already, but use the routines that you already had in place prior to all of this going on. How can we translate that into this distance learning? And some of those translate really well, and some don't, and some need some fiddling with. So one of the classroom practices that I hope some of you at least have been working with is this idea of using champs. And so what you see on the screen, and I'm going to exit out and go to a PDF version of it so I can kind of zoom in a little bit. And it is, again, this document is available to you on what I have shared with you all. This comes directly from Safe and Civil Schools, and it is fully in line with the CHAMPS approach. But it's a worksheet that walks you through the types of questions that you would need to keep in mind when setting up any sort of virtual environment. Again, if you've gone through CHAMPS trainings with me, you have seen the classroom version of this, and we've walked through it. So I don't want to belabor this, but I just want to show you kind of how this works and the kinds of questions that you want to keep in mind when setting up these sort of expectations for students. Again, this might not be something that you as an individual would need to do. Maybe you do it with your whole grade level team, right? So that this is strength in numbers. So with conversation, right, we're asking our students, are they muted or unmuted? Are they allowed to use the group chat? Can they use that private chat? There's no right or wrong answer to these questions. It's going to be totally dependent on the activity that you have planned and the maturity level and age level group of your students. So it's not that I'm advocating any right or wrong answer. I'm advocating thinking about these types of questions, because if we don't think about them ahead of time, they're going to come up in the moment and eat away from the precious instructional time that you have, right? Instructional time in a traditional setting is precious and valuable, and we need to maximize every moment, even more so now, right? Because you're doing this in 20, 30, 45-minute chunks, and we really want to maximize that learning time we have with students. And some of these things probably came through trial and error, right? Like you're probably thinking, well, yeah, now I wished I had thought of that ahead of time, because I had kids doing a private chat and it didn't go well, and it took away from my time. So the idea is that we're going to try to anticipate the misbehaviors that we might encounter and prevent them from happening in the first place. So how do kids get their help that they need? I like that this kind of differentiates between technology assistance and content assistance. So you might not be the person that kids come to for technology assistance based on your own comfort level. And so where would they go for that? Is there another teacher? Is there some sort of resource the district has put out? And hopefully they're coming to you for content. But again, you can have a conversation as a school, as a department, as a grade level team. Do we want to have somebody that's the math go-to, somebody that's the ELA go-to, somebody that's the science go-to, so that you're not asked to be everything to everyone. It's exhausting. So let's use each other. What are kiddos doing during this time? Again, are they allowed to get up and move around? And then again, being understanding of the reality that they are in. What does participation look like? Do I expect them to be in the chat? I saw a very clever post the other day. I don't know if it was Twitter or Facebook or something, but somebody posting that their student realized that if they turned off their camera and renamed themselves reconnecting, then it just looked like they were having technical difficulties through Zoom, and the teacher would ignore them. So making sure that, do I want kids to check in? A lot of teachers getting really clever with HyperDocs and using it as a way of sort of kids kind of checking in. Many of you are using Google Classroom, so it has a lot of built-in things. But whatever that expectation is, make it really clear for students. And lastly, what's the success criteria? How are we going to encourage students? How are we going to create these engaging opportunities for them? And how are we going to acknowledge when they do what we ask them to do, or at least make the attempt? Right? Even if it's not to completion, again, keeping in mind the circumstances of many of our students, we want to make sure that they're getting that positive feedback. So that's a resource for you. I know I went through it quickly, but it's something that you have and can print out and use as you see fit. Let me go back to the presentation. Again, I want to encourage collaboration on that. I think if you can come up with some as a whole grade level team, then it's not, not everybody has to do it on their own. Let me show you a couple examples that we've seen of folks that have gone through that worksheet and what they've come up with. This is a secondary example from a middle school. So you can see it's kind of text heavy, probably not appropriate for elementary or if you have non-readers. Obviously, I would encourage you to use visuals if you can with students. What I like about this is it's explicit, so that's nice and clear to read. But if I have non-readers or if I have students who English is not their strong point, I would obviously want to translate this into a language that they'd understand or use visuals. And so to that end, here's a stronger example that uses visuals as well as words and graphics to help students understand. So they've actually taken the icons of the various things that students will be using, took pictures of the cover of the workbooks the kids will be using. So it's really limiting the opportunity for kids to misunderstand. That's kind of what we're getting at. Here's another example. This was a first grade example. Obviously, there's all sorts of cute things that folks are doing through Teachers Pay Teachers and whatnot. It doesn't have to be cute. It needs to be functional, right? If cute's your thing, fine, go cute. But at the end of the day, it needs to serve its purpose. And it does this too, right? You can see off to the right there, their Champs Expectations. They've transferred over voice levels. And so many of you use voice levels back at your schools when you're in a traditional setting. And so if that's something that you think is appropriate, then feel free to do that. This is a Champs expectation chart that actually Dr. Sprick put up at a training that I went to through him. And so this was for adults. So that's why it's mostly in text. But I thought he had some unique ways of specifically on how we ask for help. Again, there's like, what, 64 of you in this room right now. And so it's hard to know if somebody needs something. So he had kind of this unique way of like, putting your finger on your nose or putting one finger up, something sort of novel that would get the speaker's attention. When it comes to movement, right, little details, so we can see your face. Something that seems obvious to us as adults, but kids maybe not so much. Here's an example that a teacher did in the moment. So this teacher used the whiteboard function that's available in Zoom. When you share your screen, it gives you the option of having a whiteboard. And so this teacher just in the moment did it live and typed it in, and the kids could see it and they had a conversation about it. So my point in showing you these examples is just to spark your imaginations, but also to realize there's no right way of doing this. The point is to understand what my expectations are and communicate them as clearly as I can to my students. If you're doing that, then you've achieved your goal. So some people say, well, do I have to use Champs? The short answer is no. If you're communicating expectations, then no, I don't care if you use the acronym or not. For me, the power of the acronym is that it's something that crosses, it breaks out of your classroom and it stretches across a school and it stretches across a district. So for me, the power in the acronym of CHAMPS is not for me personally as a teacher, it's the overall effectiveness of my school community and my district, frankly. That when kids start to see the same language over and over across their educational career, it becomes a lot more impactful. And frankly, it lessens the work for next year's teacher. And over time, it lessens the work for everybody, except for TK in kindergarten. You're always starting at ground level. So apologies to you all. But again, the strength is in the effective, the collective efficacy of you all as a school and as a district. So another example that does not explicitly use CHAMP. What this example does is has taken this school's guidelines for success, which I know many of you have, and just kind of put them into that context as well, which again is fine. But I just wanted you to see another example there. Again, you have these slides as a PDF, so don't worry about frantically taking pictures of these. So tip number 4 is as much as you have explicitly gone through and made your expectations as clear as you can, and you're going to come up with great visuals and great ways of doing it, you're going to need to do it over and over, probably every day. And again, I know that might seem silly, but again, consider all the reminders that you have to give kids in the actual classroom setting, and now we're putting them in a totally different environment. They're going to need to hear these things over and over. If you're coming at the things I've been sharing with you with a mind towards the fall, even more so, right? Because they'll have been several weeks, or several months of summer, whatever that's going to be for us. And in the fall, who knows what that's going to be. This is a recommendation that I would do if we're in a traditional setting or not, that in the beginning of the school year, we really make sure that we hammer these things over and over. And so being mindful of the types of directions that we give to students. If I'm in a classroom and I say, we're going to go around and everybody's going to share one thing that they learned from the video that we just shared, and I just simply say, go ahead, it's going to be chaos, right? Some kids aren't going to participate. Some are going to try to talk at the same time. You in your head might think, well, they're going to sort of popcorn and it's going to make sense to them. But no, if you've tried this, you know it doesn't work. So again, I know it seems silly and it's like, am I really have to go into all that detail? Yeah, you are. And many times. And so what I've given you on the screen is just one way of thinking about how explicitly we would need to be with students. So in a moment, I'm going to ask you to share one thing you learned from the video we just watched. I'm going to go alphabetically by last name. So Jaime, you're going to go first, and then Marco, and then Olivia. When it's your turn, unmute yourself and share. Right, so note all the little minutiae that kids are going to need to hear. To make sure that something that would be relatively simple in a regular classroom setting, we really need to over clarify in this virtual setting. So let's take our last few moments together and talk about how we interact with students. So in CHAMPS, you've seen this slide in the presentations that I've done with you all, and this is true now more than ever. So the idea here is that we want to provide 3 positive interactions for every corrective interaction that we have with students. And so a positive interaction doesn't mean that I'm saying something nice. It doesn't mean that I'm praising kids. It means that the kids are doing what's expected of them and I'm giving them attention for it. I'm simply acknowledging it. And so again, in a traditional classroom setting, 3 to 1 is what we're striving for. The research actually says 5 to 1. But that's a lot to do during any given day. But again, I think in the era of distance learning, this is more important than ever. If you have students who have checked out mentally, aren't engaging in things, and at one point they were, you might want to have this be at your starting place. Have I been reaching out to students, not collectively, but individually, right? Am I sending Jonathan an email and saying, Jonathan, we missed you during the Zoom yesterday. I hope everything's okay. If there's anything I can do to help, right, please let me know. Some teachers are sending out blanket emails, and that's great. That would be something we do in the all column. But as students start to pull back for whatever reason, we need to move them into that some tier and give them a little bit of that individualized attention. Am I acknowledging when they're turning in work? Yes, it's a foregone conclusion. Am I advocating praising kids for doing what's expected of them? Not necessarily. I'm not saying praise, I'm saying acknowledgement. Right? So Jeremy, you turned in yesterday's assignment. Whatever, right, you had to do at home to get that done, keep doing it because it's paying off. All right. So I'm not praising kids. I'm not saying good job. And if that's your style, go ahead. But it's more about acknowledging what they are doing. And again, I think even more so during what we have going on today. Here's an example of how powerful that can be. This is from a Facebook friend of mine. We used to work together when I was a principal in Las Virgenes. She has since moved to, I think, Montana, hence all the snow in her little profile picture there. But she recently adopted a son. He's like 9 years old, I think. And she posted this, and I asked her permission if I could share it. And so she went on a Google Hangout, and the teacher gave some help. And this is what her son shared, is that she makes my day. And when I asked her permission to share this, she said, well, it wasn't really a big deal. Like, it wasn't, the communication they had wasn't even like SEL heavy. It was really just to get help on math. And I said to her, well, that's the point. That's what I want teachers to see, is like that connection with kids is so amazing and so powerful. And you are feeling it every day, I know, and you're doing incredible things yourselves. But I don't want you to lose sight of that power that we really have. Even if SEL is not at the forefront, and I hope it is, even if it's an academic conversation, there is still great power in students getting that moment of your time. And so my kind of question to all of you is kind of what efforts are we making to connect with our students kind of collectively and individually? And so originally I was going to do a breakout session, but I think based on time, if you want to kind of put your thoughts into the chat, and I think, again, what are some of those unique things that you are doing to help meet the needs of those students? So think about that all and that some part of our pyramid. What are you doing for all students? What might you be doing for some students? I'm particularly interested in, and I know it's not in the question I put up here, but I think for our time, it would be helpful. What are you doing for kids that are checking out? Kids that maybe at one point seem to be really engaged, but you sense them pulling back, or for students that were never engaged to begin with. I'd really be curious, and I think the room would benefit from hearing what your efforts are along those lines. So go ahead and please start typing in the chat. And Dave and Helen and myself, as we see things coming up that might need some clarification or you can elaborate on, maybe we'll ask you to unmute and elaborate on that. I'm going to move forward as you type things in. Skipping this, but see how explicit I was going to be with my breakout room instruction. I even had a separate champs for our breakout rooms. So again, something to consider. Again, being really explicit with those instructions. And so again, the question before you is, how are you finding ways to connect with students collectively and individually? And again, I'm selfishly particularly interested in engaging students that are not engaged, and hopefully you're typing some of those into the chat.
Yeah.
Totally.
I mean, we do have people sharing. Things that are coming up in chat are teachers meeting in small groups, increasing the number of small groups as opposed to large group meetings. Hosting fun Friday Zooms is a favorite. Using Zoom to meet with students collectively and with all that Zoom has to offer as far as participation. Home visit, private Zooms for kids that need it. Making daily videos, and in these videos mentioning kids by names, and making them feel special. Text messages to parents to keep them connected. Making phone calls to parents, keeping them after a few minutes after meetings have ended to converse with them. Communicating with individual students through email. Phone calls work, phone calls to parents, giving individual attention to students, trying to encourage them to join live Zoom sessions, using Screencastify to make video tutorials and also to discuss responses and what they call great mistakes. Sonia Gonzalez, I'm going to have you do a TST on that sometime. Meeting with students in small groups and also taking time to meet with parents. Phone calls, one-on-one Google Meet, small groups and phone calls. Oh, actually calling additional contacts on students' emergency cards to relay messages in hopes that they can help connect students. Personal phone calls. Calls where we don't talk about academics. We just talk about their well-being.
Yeah, I love it.
Google Classroom, home visits, staff meetings. Oh, using everybody, counselors, admin, support staff. Kahoot. Kids love Kahoot.
Yeah, they do. And again, I think it's great. Kahoot just for fun, right? Doesn't have to be academic necessarily.
So a couple people bring up the app Remind. I'm using the app Remind to connect.
Wonderful.
Google Slides and.
So let me do a quick plug for the Postal Service, right? There's and especially for the end of the year, obviously Postal Service isn't as immediate as the things you just mentioned. But think about the end of the year, I'm seeing teachers posting images of them packing up their classrooms and how sad that is to not be with their students during this time. And while it's certainly not a substitute for that, right? Sending a little handwritten note to kids in the mail. I mean, the novelty of getting something in the mail, period, is pretty amazing. I mean, there's the lost art of letter writing. Just a handwritten note from your teacher saying that, you wish them a happy summer and can't wait to, hopefully see them in some sort of way in the fall, I think would mean the world to kids. I love the ideas you all were sharing, especially that Fun Friday. That, yeah, not everything we have to do has to be academic, and there's great benefit in that. I think if you can fold in some academics, great. But I've seen some teachers that will they'll do something cute, like post an easy recipe with that's age appropriate, and they'll kind of share their results, even if it's a failure, as you were saying, Helen, and asking kids to kind of share their results as well. Just that shared common experience is can be really helpful. And so that's the last thing I want to share. I'm going to go through these really quickly. You all have some great ideas. I'm just going to layer onto them that having those shared experiences that we can connect, right? And sometimes that opens the door for something academic, but if not, fine. It's just that idea that we're connecting. And so again, this idea about having an age appropriate recipe and having kids share the results. This teacher was actually one of my eldest daughter's English teacher, and she asked kids to send in pictures of their pets. And she's been sharing those, so you could ask people to, funny stories, their siblings, whatever. There's a virtual calming space that some schools have created, and you don't need to make your own. You can steal someone else's. And so in the resources I shared with you, there's one. Just a nice place to, again, model for kids that we need to take time for ourselves, and things can be hectic, and some of these things might help. A lot of people are doing the Getty Museum Challenge, where they're looking at a work of art and trying to recreate it at home. Encourage you to go beyond art, right? How could you model photosynthesis with the things at home and share us a picture of those sorts of things, or create a book cover for your favorite book, things like that. Just things that are kind of interactive. What I like about this too is, yes, it requires you something digital to share it, but it doesn't require anything digital to create it. And I think that's important to keep in mind as well, because while technology opens the doors for the kinds of things we can do for kiddos, there's the downside to it. And I think we're all worried before all this happened about screen time with kids. Well, now we're mandating screen time. And so I know for me, I have to put my phone away. I have to put my computer away. I need to go outside and feel the sun on my face. Otherwise I go a bit nuts. And so kids need that too. So kind of brings us back, hopefully, toward this guiding question that we started out with is, and I hopefully I've given you a couple tips, or at least got your brains thinking along this line of, we still need to have high expectations for students academically and behaviorally, and hopefully I've given you a couple tools on how you can do that while still having that compassionate heart, while still understanding where kiddos are at. So again, what I would suggest is the things I've shared, right, can be where we start, and then if you need to tweak it, so be it. But it's not, we don't want to start with a lower bar and then have to ramp it up. That's a much harder hill to climb than having something really tight, and then you loosen it as needed for kiddos that might need those circumstances. The thing that I keep hearing from teachers is they wish they could do more. And I get it, and I'm there with you. But whatever you are doing is making the difference in the life of these kiddos, and what you are doing is enough. Be mindful of the stress that you're putting on yourself, and take care of yourselves as well. So that's the end of my sort of structured time together. Depending on what you have going on, I have time if there's Q&A or thoughts. But Dave, I'll kick it back to you.
Yeah, no, Jeremy, thank you so much. I really appreciate your strategies and tips that you kind of shared. I think it's very timely. And I can only speak for myself. My 7th grade son, initially the teacher, said you don't really need to check in. And now she's trying to get them to check in. And of course he doesn't want to, because she said you don't have to. So I'm struggling with that. But anyway, I think these are all very great ideas for us to ponder and think about, especially now, but also as we look forward to the future. How are we going to set those expectations from the get-go to make sure that we're engaging all students? So thank you very much, Jeremy. We appreciate
my pleasure.
here. It's always nice to see you. Everyone, thank you very much for being with us this morning. Liz did have the day off today, which was wonderful, but I think she'll be back. Helen, what's moving on with our TSTs?
They are still in development.
Yes.
More to follow.
More to follow. Well, thank you, everyone. We appreciate your time. I hope you all have a great rest of the day and a great weekend. Thanks. Bye-bye.
Hi, thanks, everyone.